I wanted to make a video just to look at this kind of key question. It's been raised by many scientists. I think one of the more recent people that's raised it of high profile is an Oxford professor of evidence-based medicine, Carl Hennigan, who pointed out that the infections appear to peak before the lockdowns are implemented. Now, I wanted to have a look at that, and before I do, I wanted to show a kind of unique perspective on the scientific community and the fact that it is divided, because I think so many people think that there's this unity around the fact that the science tells us that lockdown is right. So what I'm just going to quickly edit in here is a video of Professor Michael Levitt from Stanford University, who's a professor of biostatistics and a Nobel Prize winner, who is having quite a heated argument with Imperial College.
There's no doubt that once lockdown has been forced, everyone's going to believe it was a good thing, because otherwise, why did we do it? But there's no evidence for it.
It's not about believing if it's a good thing. What mechanism do you conjecture for the plateauing of deaths in the UK that's not lockdown?
It reached one in 1,000. It had nothing to do with lockdown. You managed to, the UK policy led to early saturation. The whole country was infected before lockdown was done. Same thing was true in New York.
No serological data supports this hypothesis.
Well, let's. This is going to saturate at 20% serology. We know that already. I mean, you know, this assumption that it's 80% based on R0 is basically nonsense. You guys are making. You don't know what you guys are doing to yourselves. You guys are going to end up being responsible for $100 billion crisis to the world, and this is not funny. And you start to use clean terminology. Don't estimate herd immunity from an R0 value, which is completely meaningless. If the R0 value is 1.3, then I get saturation at 25%. The Diamond Princess, this wonderful experiment, saturated at 25%. And you can say, oh, it was such good lockdown. We had shared air conditioning. We had an aged population. It doesn't work. In other words, there needs to be sanity checks. And the sanity checks come from looking at the data.
So why would any kind of argument like that exist? Well, this comes to sort of looking at, you know, is it plausible that lockdown is the mechanism by which the reduction of the R rate occurred, by which the epidemic was forced into retreat? And before I sort of define this, I think we need to talk about lockdown as a series of processes. It is about not just a voluntary social distancing. That would be an argument for a Swedish style model almost. This is to say, look, you know, it is about a legal enforcement of a lockdown, but we do need to allow into this some kind of preemptive social distancing from the population in order to answer this question, you know, fairly. So what happened in the UK is that we had voluntary social distancing advice from the government on the 16th of March to work from home if possible and to limit our social contact if possible. By the 21st of March, all the pubs, cafes, restaurants, gyms, schools, etc. were closed. There were announcements before that date, but that was the date on which they were all shut and didn't reopen until, you know, very recently. The 23rd of March is when the famous speech, if you like, the 5 p.m. announcing the stay-at-home order. The lockdown is thought to begin, but actually legally it didn't begin until the 26th of March. So it's just important to look across the entire kind of spectrum of those dates when analysing it. Now, in order to understand, you know, did the lockdown work, we have to sort of say, well, why did we expect it to work? What's the model that we're using? And we have to go back to the Imperial College model, because that was the rationale by which the government locked down. Now, it should be stressed that that model was not peer reviewed, and actually when it did finally become peer reviewed not that long ago, it was met by quite a lot of criticism. But nevertheless, we have to use that as our benchmark, because that is the rationale of what we expected at the time. We also have to bear in mind that when Neil Ferguson created this model, it was the 9th of March, and there was very little data around, particularly for the UK. So what did he predict? He predicted that there would be an R rate of 2.5, meaning that the epidemic would grow by 2.5 times every 4 days. That's what it means. That's specific to COVID, that 4-day time frame, but that's what 2.5 means for COVID. He also predicted that 80% of the population will become infected, and he took from the results in China the fact that 1% case fatality rate. So again, predicting a 1% case fatality rate. On that basis, without intervention, he believed that 500,000 plus people would die from the epidemic, that if we locked down, we could limit social contact by 70%, reduce the R rate by 0.5, meaning that we'd immediately go into a situation where the epidemic would be in retreat, and that sudden cutting short of the epidemic could save up to 480,000, sorry, more than 480,000 lives, that only 20,000 lives would be lost. Now that was the prediction. So what is that? How do we even look at that? So what we need to do is to fit this this prediction to the deaths data, and there are two very important components that I need to explain there. One is why use the deaths data, and the other is why transform that back by 23 days, this kind of magical number that comes out of nowhere. The peak of the deaths in the UK was on the 8th of April. That's clearly after the lockdown, and I'm just suddenly going to move that completely by 23 days and talk about the fact that it actually occurred before the lockdown. Now, I don't think it'd be a good idea for me to justify that all by myself. So what I've done is just interleave a part of a webinar from Imperial College where they explain why we use deaths and why we transfer that back by 23 days.
We don't use case data, we use death data. The reason we don't use case data is it largely reflects testing. It suffers tremendously from under-ascertainment, which as Cecil just said, before, it's exactly that with deaths as well, but it's far worse with cases.
Right, the second key part of the model that I want to come to, that Sam has already mentioned, is that we are not directly fitting to cases. This is because the reported cases, they're not randomly statistically well measured. They don't account for asymptomatic. The cases are subject to a number of biases. So what we use instead that we think is a better measure is deaths. So to come back to what Michael said, we are fitting, and we're fitting not to cases, but we're fitting to deaths. So just to say that for this distribution, which says your likelihood of dying at some period of time after becoming infected, this is derived from parameters that our colleagues at Imperial College have worked on, or from the literature, and we know that the time distribution from becoming infected to seeing symptoms is about 5 days roughly, and is well described by this gamma distribution. And similarly, the time from symptom onset to death is around 17, 18, 19 days. So together we can estimate the time from infection to death.
So based on the infection to death time of 23 days as shown on that slide, they're showing you that it's a 5-day delay from infection to symptoms and 18 days from symptoms to death. Technically we should be saying 22.9 days, but there's no really way to model that, so 23 days is a good enough estimate, especially considering all the other factors of noise that are involved here. So now what we need to do is to take our daily deaths curve and to move it back 23 days. Now, if I just plotted that out, you'd get quite steep lines, these exponential curves. You get the same thing from the Imperial College model. It'd be very hard to look at whether we're actually trying to fit to the model. And that's what a logarithmic scale that we can see here on the left is good for. You can see these numbers on the left don't go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. This is logarithmic, and what does it do? It turns the exponential curves that would be there into straight lines. And we can see that straight away. The Imperial model, the dotted line, is here as, basically mostly straight with a curved patch between the two, and actually the daily deaths fit along that. We've also got 4 vertical lines here. The first line is the voluntary social distancing line, so that's the 16th of March. The second one is when the pubs and restaurants and schools are shut. The third one is the government announces the lockdown, and the fourth one is the legal inaction of the lockdown. So what am I doing here? I'm making sure that you can see all of the different steps and processes and how we've mapped across it. Now, what can we see straight away? We can see, so I've tried to fit the model directly to this data, and as you can see, it's a pretty good fit. And that initially suggests that this isn't a bad model. So we can see that we do have this period of time when things are growing, and they seem to roughly be growing at an R of 2.5 in line with the model. And then on the other side, the R is a little bit lower from the model than reality. And that's, you know, a stubbornness of COVID, and we all know that it's been stubborn, but I don't think that's enough to say the model was a load of rubbish. That certainly suggests it's a good model. Now, the only thing I would say, and the most interesting part of this, is that to fit this as best I can, I should really curve around about here. So this is sort of saying I should create this curve around about the date of the 16th. And that's quite interesting that I would need to do that. So let's look at why the curve is where it is in terms of how I've modeled social distancing, because that's what's causing the slow change between one straight line and the other straight line, which produces that curve. So here's my model of social distancing. We've got those 4 lines again, the voluntary social distancing on the 16th, the pubs, schools, etc. shut on the 21st, the announcement on the 23rd, and the legal inaction on the 26th. Now, what have I done here? I've said, look, you know, people were social distancing even before the government told them to. A certain portion, particularly the people that are most nervous, so maybe we had a 20% reduction in social contact. Then, once the announcement goes into effect, we would have had quite strong reductions in the contact that we had right up to that announcement. And so what I've done is built in, you know, between these two, the vast majority of the reduction in social contact is made before even the government announces. And then really only a small amount of reduction after that, because remember 5 p.m. that wouldn't be like a huge amount of social contact after that time of day anyway. And so the fact that, you know, 5 p.m. the announcement gets made, by the next day we see sort of petering out of some of this social contact until it legally comes into force on the 26th. Now, why not go further back? Why not more extreme? Why not go and fit the data better and start a curve, you know, a social distancing curve back here somewhere? And it's a simple reason. If I do that, I'm not actually saying that lockdown worked. I'm saying that voluntary social distancing works, and that's quite different. Now, we will see that there are ways to look at that too as we move forward, but I think just as an initial set of predictions, I don't want to go into essentially abandoning what Imperial College is saying and going immediately into a Swedish model just to fit the data. That seems like the wrong thing to do. So let's have a look at this on a linear scale, and suddenly the whole thing looks tremendously different. This is not what we were expecting to see, but the reason this suddenly becomes true is on an exponential scale, because you've got that kind of 1,000 to 10,000. 1,000 and 3,000 are actually not that far apart. They're only kind of 0.2 or a fifth of one of these gradations, which meant we didn't see that it was very far apart. It was good for looking at the fit of the curves. That got them as good as they could be. But suddenly now we can see the absolute numbers. We can see how drastically different this model was from reality. And this theme is getting stronger that we've already seen. So whereas before, whereas the model is sort of saying, you know, this social distancing starts increasing and we start seeing curvature here, curving over and down again later. What happens in reality is this flattening. There's some sort of flat period of time that starts early, right at the outset of social distancing, but it's very hard to say exactly when a peak is, exactly when it curves over. What we need to do is to take some of this noise out. So what do I mean by noise? What I mean is that we can see that we've got this up-down pattern. Now this up-down pattern, ups, peaks, middle of the week. This is where we play catch-ups on deaths that we failed to record at the weekends. And that's what creates this structure you're seeing, this up and down structure. And it means that it's very hard for us to see something. So can we get rid of those ups and downs so we can see this a little more clearly? And the answer is yes, that can be done using a 7-day average. So a 7-day average is simply the idea that if we're measuring on a Wednesday, we add up everything from Sunday to Saturday and we average it. And then for Thursday, we go from Monday to Sunday. And for Friday, we go from Tuesday to the following Monday. So we have this rolling window that moves across 7 days long, we average together. Actually, that makes a lot of sense here, because what we've had is things at the weekends spilling out into the middle of weeks. By doing this averaging, we're almost pulling that back out and smoothing it. And that's why this looks quite, this looks really nice, that the 7-day average is giving us, the moving 7-day average is giving us a curve that's absolutely in line with the general shape of the data without us seeing those ups and downs. So it is a way of removing that visual distraction. And now we can take this daily deaths data that's been smoothed and go back to these charts and see what we see. Immediately, it becomes obvious that we are dealing with a peak pretty early on. There's a flattening here. There's probably some kind of reduction at this point. This is interesting because it's curving all the way through, and we can now see it. And it's expanding quicker than we think before, than the model at the early stages, and then slows down gradually and then crosses back over. So this is not a process that happens overnight. This is something that is continuous, and we can see it, but it's difficult to see precisely. And again, if linearly, we can have a different perspective, but there are still things that are hard to see. So we can see again the peak. We can probably isolate that peak a lot more tightly now in the middle of that week. We can see the flat period exponentially and it being a little longer than we probably thought on the log scale. We can see the over component, but not the curve over so well. That's not so obvious on linear. So the only real way to look at this properly is to use an R rate type measure. And the danger, I think, of an R rate type measure is that people then go into a mathematical mumbo jumbo very quickly. How does that happen? Really simple. It starts by selling you a simple idea, and it's a good idea at the basis of an exponential model, which is that each person goes on to infect a number of other people. The R rate is a measure of the average number of people that someone infects. And therefore, if we have a handle on the R rate, we have a handle on the epidemic. But actually, that's not really what's going on. We have lots of overlapping infectiousness periods from people that are getting infected and remaining infectious for, say, from day 4 to day 20, or, depending on the severity of the illness, it changes. Lots of overlapping windows of infectiousness. And what that means is, especially if we don't really understand what's going on with the disease, and we don't know how infectious people are at different points. We've got certain evidence to point that it starts around the day before symptoms, but we're not entirely sure. There's a great variability about how long people stay infectious, and we still don't know whether after symptoms go away, people are still infectious. So trying to work out what an R rate is on that basis is really, really difficult and leads to very complicated mathematics based on a whole bunch of assumptions that actually we can't be certain of. So that's not a very clever way to do it. However, you could just be really simple and just say, look, let's create a little motto for what an R rate is. An R rate is simply answering a question. Are things getting better or are things getting worse? Simple, right? That's all we need. We need a measure that's constantly telling us, are things getting better or are things getting worse? So the easiest way to achieve that measure is just simply to divide today's deaths by yesterday's deaths, if you like. So if there are 100 deaths today and 100 deaths yesterday, you divide one by the other, that gives you 1. And because there's 100 on both days, clearly things are not getting better or worse. Now, if there were 150 deaths today and 100 deaths yesterday, then we'd have an R of 1.5 and clearly things are getting worse. And if we had 50 deaths today and 100 deaths yesterday, our R would be 0.5 and clearly things would be getting better because the number of deaths were dropping. And so all you need to do to come up with an R rate that might not be kind of that theoretical idea of trying to unpick all this infectiousness, but just an R rate that answers that question: are things getting better or are things getting worse, and by how much, if we now put a number on it. All we need to do is divide one day by the last day, and that's all I've done here, is to take that smooth data and then divide one day by the last day to see how things are generally moving in the UK. Right? And we get a completely different picture to what we're expecting. So what do we expect? We should be expecting the R rate to be roughly constant, because while we're in this early stage, there isn't any social distancing really going on. If we're having an exponential growth, then the number of people, each day we should see the same proportionate growth. That's what exponential growth means. So this R rate should be constant. It should come into this period of time, And then somewhere around here, it should start dropping and then really dropping and then to the floor. Now, people will debate whether it should drop a little bit earlier here or whether it should drop really quite a bit later. You know, some people have said, you know, it might take 2 weeks for lockdown to work, and that's quite credible. But what we're definitely seeing is the complete opposite of any of those expectations, where we've got a falling R rate from the beginning all the way down. And even though, you know, social distancing voluntarily comes in here and is having an impact, it doesn't seem, well, it's not necessarily having an impact, it's going down at the same time social distancing comes in. It seems to be in line with the previous reductions. And then we get a flattening of the R rate, and it is pretty much constant from that point forward. So what were we expecting? We were expecting some big drop in this region here, and we're absolutely not getting that. That's incredible. Not only are we saying that there is no, that you don't have a, you know, you don't have the peak after lockdown as you'd expect. Probably you'd expect there to be some delays, so the model would lag a little bit, and you'd certainly forgive the model for that quite easily and just say, look, you know, it had to spread through people's houses. You know, that there was still some residual contact levels going on. Very easy to explain why the peak would come after lockdown by, you know, even a couple of weeks actually. But how to explain it coming before the lockdown is very difficult. And you could do that with some voluntary social distancing, preemptive social distancing, if that was a curve that came out, you know, from the left quite straight for a good period of time and then dropped somewhere around here. But I think it's really clear that that's not what's going on. That's not what the data is telling us. Now, does that mean the lockdown didn't work? No, I'm not going to go as far as that. I'm not going to say that means that lockdown didn't work or it didn't save lives. What I am going to say is that the evidence that you should see based on the models and the predictions and what we were promised and the outcomes are not there in the data. That's a very different thing. There could have been other impacts that we don't understand. But based on what we can see, that's why we have this effect. Now, why did I show Michael Levitt at the start? Because he's a Nobel Prize winning biostatistician who spotted this pattern even before the infection got outside of China. The problem is, I think, between the messaging around, you know, the Chinese and how much they kind of talked about the lockdown working, and our panic and our desire to get into it. As he said, once lockdown was in place, we believed it had to work, and then we assumed that this natural effect, and we can come back to that in a second, was the reason for the reduction. But actually, most outbreaks, MERS, SARS, H1N1, etc., are sub-exponential. They don't hold this exponential structure. That's a theoretical thing. It's not a practical thing. We don't exactly know why diseases don't actually spread exponentially, but typically we see this R rate reduction quite soon in an outbreak because, well, we don't know because, but the best theory is because we're not actually uniformly connected. Our society isn't uniformly interconnected. There are groups, group boundaries, and actually the virus sort of takes hold in a group and spreads quickly, but then when it gets to the boundaries of that group, it can't spread so fast. It's a sort of slow-moving thing. And obviously real outbreaks have big swells and drops caused by getting into new groups and out of new groups. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So the truth is that when you look at this, you can definitely tell two things. One is that the infections did peak before lockdown, and that the rate at which the virus was spreading had reduced sizably even before voluntary social distancing, and continued to reduce, but came to a basically pretty much the minimum, though it does slowly tail off after this, pretty much the minimum before lockdown came into place, and that is why the peak curved over. So the peak is before lockdown, and it did not occur due to voluntary social distancing or lockdown. However, as I said, there is still room to say, you know, there could be other effects in there, could have been other things that would have happened without a lockdown. It's not enough to conclusively say that lockdown didn't work, but it is enough to say the evidence does not support the assertion that it worked in this case, and it does not mean that you can be so confident about that assertion. If we were to explore cases, you would throw at me that there would be a different peak roughly around the 14th of April. The delay actually, people think of case data as being live. It's not. It takes about 9 days for a test to occur, but that's still the 5th of it's still the 5th of April, still well within April, well after lockdown. But the problem with cases is there's a massive increase in testing. There are about 5,500 tests a day in around the 23rd of March. By the time you get into the 14th of April, you're up to 10,000 tests a day. If you look at the percentage of positive tests that come out of tests, so was it 25 people, 30%, 40%, sorry, of people that were infected, then that maximizes out on the 4th of April at about 43% of tests, and then remains fairly constant from that point forward before eventually reducing down. So what does that tell us? That does tell us, if you take 9 days from that, that's the 25th of March. So that's just inside of lockdown. Now that's, again, not conclusive evidence either way, but it shows that you've got a real conflict between what the deaths data can tell you and what the case data can tell you. But as I showed at the beginning of the video, the case data is a highly problematic thing to work with. Now, what I'm just going to finish this off with is appending a short video on how to gather your own data and do your own analysis, because I think the main thing here is that we shouldn't just trust the experts. We should go out and do this for ourselves. It's very easy to do, and I hope through that video I will show you, that short bit of video at the end, I'll show you how to get this, how to get your own results and to check everything that I did in this presentation. Thank you.
Right, so in this add-on segment, I just wanted to basically show you how to get data for yourself and to do all the calculations that you saw in that video, because I think it's really important that this is not just a trust the experts kind of exercise. There's too many people arguing. I think it's really good to be able to get hold of data for yourself. You don't need to be an expert, just a basic understanding of Excel and numbers is enough. And then it doesn't actually take too much effort. So where do I go when I pick up numbers? A lot of the numbers from around the world are being pulled together by Worldometer. Quite helpfully, they do quite a lot of work pulling different sources of data. It actually gets better all the time, the granularity, which is fantastic. Here you can see the sort of landing page, worldometers.info/coronavirus. And if we go there, we immediately get a headline number. We scroll down the page, there are all sorts of statistics and charts, but eventually we get to the table of countries. We just click on the UK for the moment. Then we get a similar looking page, but this time just talking about what's going on in the UK. We go down, as I said, we're going to look at the deaths. We don't really want to look at the cases. If we want to get the data out, it's a little bit of a faff, but it doesn't take too long. We can copy this across to a spreadsheet. So here's my spreadsheet, and here are the total deaths. And all I've been doing is copying numbers across. So, I've gone up to, why did I start at the 4th? That was because that was the 5th is the first day there's a death. And then if I put my selection here, and then find where I left off, which is the 14th, I can now copy the numbers into this sheet relatively easily, and we can see the total deaths piling up each day inside of the UK. We can transfer that over to a spreadsheet, which we can then use to do more analysis. So I'll just only do a small amount of this. Obviously, you would do the entire curve typically. And then once you've done it once, you can just simply top it up multiple times. So here's my spreadsheet. I've got my total deaths. Really, I need to be looking at my daily deaths. And that's very simple. I just take 1 day's deaths away from the previous day's deaths away from the current day's deaths, and I get the daily deaths. So there are my daily deaths. It's a very, very simple way of getting that data. The next thing I showed was to take a 7-day average. And we get that by summing together a week's worth, 7 cells. Now what we need to do is to go down at least 4, so to this cell here, so that we actually have the number of cells to average. Otherwise, we won't have that. So by using a technique like this, we do lose the very start of the curve of the data. But to be honest, the reporting back right at the start is very scarce. There's not a lot of data, so you're not really missing much. And I wouldn't ever try and do an analysis on so few data points. So we can immediately see now we've got a 7-day average, adding together all of these. we can now just drag that down and get a list. It'll be a little bit short at the bottom because I haven't filled in the bottom of the data. And then I showed you like an R rate type measure by dividing one day by the other. Very simple. We take today's average deaths and divide it by yesterday's average deaths. And that gives us a statistic. So there we go. That's our number. We can do that all the way down to there. So you'll notice my chart roughly starts on the 18th of February. Well, one thing we haven't done here is to add the adjusted date. So we can do that now. So insert a column for the adjusted date. And then that's simply created by taking 23 days away from the date on the left. And now you can see I've got my dates. If we look at where I started my analysis, that was on the 18th of February. There. Why? Because actually this kind of shape of increasing R rate is probably just caused by missing deaths before that date. So I'm just sensibly saying, do you know what, actually, let's skip this super high R rate here that's probably all about catch up. Let's start at a reasonable number and then see what happens. Yeah. So what I hope I've done in that video is just to quickly show you exactly how you can get the data from worldometers, copy it into a spreadsheet, calculate the daily deaths simply by subtracting one day from the other, do a sum of 7 days, and then divide it by 7, and then take one day and divide by the other. Now, you can take that data and insert a chart, which I won't do here because I don't have enough data, and then you'll be able to see exactly what I showed you, and then just mark on the chart one way or another. I actually use Photoshop, but a lot of people wouldn't have access to that, to mark on the chart where the lockdown dates are, and then you'll quickly see the same patterns you saw in the video that I've just shown. Thank you for listening.